times you push the button, if you don't turn the clicker on, it won't work. All right, well, good morning. Woke up this morning and I don't really pay much attention to the weather, but it's supposed to be 77 degrees. It's going to be a beautiful day. And then as I was sitting there watching TV, drinking some coffee, I heard all of the pomp and circumstance about the Poxitony Field, or whatever his name is. I don't know if we saw his shadow or not. I'm going to guess that we have 6 more weeks. It seems like we always do. But, anyway, beautiful day. And then I guess it's also the biggest, most anticipated day of the year for sports fans. We got the Super Bowl kicking off this afternoon. So lots of stuff going on. I'm glad you're here. Hope to see you back at 5 o'clock tonight as well. So if you have your Bibles, be turning to Genesis 16, and we're going to look at the passage that Cole read, and we're actually going to look at the entire chapter here in just a few minutes. But I really enjoy going back to some of these Old Testament passages and learning some characteristics about God that we can find from these passages. And I want to spend a little bit of time doing that this morning. But before I go on, I want to provide a little bit of context. One thing that we have to remember when we look at these stories is things are happening on multiple levels. Things are taking place on multiple levels in a passage like this. And we watch TV shows and movies and those sorts of things, and we're familiar with that. We understand that movies have different levels to the stories, different plot lines going on. And as you know, we now have some toddlers in our house that we haven't had. So I have become reacquainted with some of the animated films that I used to watch, and one of those is Toy Story, and I want to use it. I think most of us are familiar with Toy Story, the movie Toy Story. If you're not, we're gonna offer an invitation later, and you can come repent then. But Toy Story is a great movie. Several movies. I think there's 3 of them with it. But if you think about that movie, and you think about the different levels that are going on. So on one level of that movie, it's on a very personal level. It's about Sheriff Woody, who is a toy, and about his relationship with Andy, the little boy who owns him. And then on another level, there's another level to this story about the world of toys and how they're alive and how they interact in a human world. And then on yet another level, and really the entire series is about this, the big conceptual level about the movie is just the passage of time and about growing up. And so we recognize that when we see movies like that there's different things going on. The movie's working on several different levels. One thing that we tend to struggle with, one thing that I really have struggled with in the past is forgetting, when I look at these passages, how things are happening on different levels. And I think that's probably because as a kid I learned all the stories. And so, on the individual stories I got, but I didn't put them together as well as maybe as what I should have. But in all of these stories, we can see God working on multiple levels. But do we always see the big picture? Do we see what's going on? So, in this particular passage, God's going to show up. There's going to be an encounter with God. And so when we see that type of thing taking place, we remember, okay, so one level of this is the interaction between God and the person that he's interacting with. On another level, God is working a bigger plan through his people. And then this big conceptual level is all going to culminate in Jesus' work on the cross, in God's plan for redeeming man. So when we look at a story like this, we need to keep that in mind. So here in Genesis 16, we are picking up in the middle of a story. So I want to provide just a little bit of context. A few chapters earlier, we see that God has made a promise to one man. That man is Abram. And the promise is about how through Abram and his wife Sarai, God is going to create this people for himself. And a people who are going to bless many nations. And then there's something on a bigger level going on with God and this one family. So there's multiple things going on. And in this story, it's eventually going to culminate with what Jesus is going to do for all of creation. So in the midst of what's happening, God promises this old man that he and his wife are going to have a child. And on a personal level, they wait, And they wait, and they wait, and nothing happens, so they decide, hey, we're just going to come up with our own game plan. And so what I want to warn you of is what we're going to read here in Genesis 16 on a personal level is hard. It's heavy. And, you know, it weighs on us when we can see the pain and the anguish that people go through on a personal level. But what I want us to see is that even in the mess, God meets us there. God meets us in the middle of the mess. And so God's there with us in the pain. And so here in Genesis 16, there's glimmers of hope in what God's doing on a bigger level. But I really want us to zone in on what God is doing on a personal level here with Hagar. And this is a longer passage than I normally would read, but I want to read the entire chapter of chapter 16. So if you have your Bibles, you can follow along, or I'm going to put it up on the screen. So let's read Genesis 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant, and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell against all his kinmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God of seed. For she said, Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer-lahai. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. Okay, so as I said, God is working on something out on a big level here. But on the personal level, we can see a lot of pain, we can see a lot of heartache, we can see a lot of anguish that's going on. There's infertility. And the pain and the hurt of infertility leads to more hurt. It leads to manipulation. It leads to abuse. Now, we're going to get to God's encounter with Hagar here in a minute, but before we do, I want to look at something from the beginning of chapter 16. So, one thing that we have to keep in mind is just because we read something in Scripture, that doesn't necessarily mean that God approves of it. God inspired the writers to be honest about what happened. But just because the Bible describes something doesn't mean that the Bible prescribes something. So we have to keep that in mind. I believe that God does this because He wants us to realize that regardless of how big the mess is, He can work out His purposes through that. You know, our sin is not too big of an obstacle for God to work through. We could spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about the consequences of sin. It'd be a good place to do that, but we're not going to do that this morning. We talk about a need for good relationships. That'd be a good place to jump off and talk about that, but we're not going to do that. We could contrast the faithfulness of man and the faithfulness of God. Again, we're not going to do that. None of those are the things I specifically want to focus on today. But we do need to realize and recognize that these are God's people, but they aren't really acting like God's people. And so we can see God's grace taking place in this mess. So I do want us to focus on Hagar this morning. In this story, God shows up to the least respected, the least expected person in the entire story. You know, Hagar is the last person that you would expect to have an encounter with the Almighty. Yet, that's the person that God shows up to. In verse 7, we see Hagar is fleeing from the fear and the abuse that's been taking place. And she encounters God like she's never encountered God before. And there's a few things that we can learn from this. The first one is that God finds us when we're lost. By every definition of the word, Hagar is lost. I just want you to stop and think about this for a minute. She is not in a place where she belongs. She's in a place where she was bought. She's a servant. Now, we're not told how Hagar ended up in Abram's house. A few chapters earlier, Abram and his caravan are in Egypt, and the Pharaoh gives Abram a lot of stuff, and part of what's mentioned is male and female servants. So maybe that's how this Egyptian woman ended up being a servant of Sarai. We don't know that. But she's not where she belongs. She's in a place where she was bought. The other thing is that this is a patriarchal society. This is a man-dominated society, and she's a woman. So that's strike one. She's in a house of people who are going to become God's chosen people. They're going to become Jews. She's an Egyptian. She's a Gentile. So that's strike two. And then in a house of free people, she's a slave. She's a servant. Strike three. So she's lost. She doesn't belong. Yet this is the person that God chose us to show up to. God finds us when we're lost. You're never too lost for God to find you. And you know what? When God comes looking for you, He's going to find you. Verse 7, look at that again. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. All right, no GPS. Kids, there wasn't a snap map for God to find her. How does He do that? How does He find Hagar here? In this passage it says the angel of the Lord. Now there's some debate about what that means. Some scholars say that this phrase, when you see it in the Old Testament, that it could be the pre-incarnate Christ showing up. In other words, before Christ showed up in the New Testament, fully God and fully man, that He appeared as an angel of the Lord. And they would say it's not the angel of the Lord, it's the angel who is the Lord. Now, you know, I guess some validity to that would be the fact that when we see Hagar interacting here in a minute, she's going to be talking like she was talking to God. The other thing that I think that gives that argument some legs is the fact that it appears to be a foreshadowing of how Christ shows up. And what I mean by that is, who did Christ minister to? He ministered to the rejected, to the despised, to the people on the outcast of society, people who were desperate. You know, that's the God that Hagar encounters. Now, you know, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I definitely think it's a foreshadowing of Christ here. But she's disenfranchised, she's been mistreated, and you know, that's the people that Jesus brought hope to as well. So whether or not it's the pre-incarnate Christ, I don't know, but it is God finding the lost. God is looking for people who are desperate and people who don't know what's going on. And that's the God that Hagar encounters here. It's a picture of a God who pursues. God finds us when we're in our worst moments, and we have to keep that in mind, even when we don't deserve it. You know, Hagar wasn't looking for God. Not only does God find us when we're lost, but in a lost state, God gives new direction. New purpose. Did you notice what the angel said in the next verse? Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. Okay, so Hagar's being honest about what's going on here. But did you notice she could only answer part of the question? The only part of that question she could answer was where she's coming from. She can't answer the second part. She can't tell where she's going. She can't say where she's going. For some of us, we might have spent part of our lives running from things, like Hagar is running from. We may not have an answer for where we're headed. We just know that's not what we want. I don't want a parent like that. I don't want a relationship like that. I don't want a marriage like that. I don't want those kind of responsibilities. Whatever it is, most of us have something in our past that we want to distance ourselves from. And Satan uses that to warp our minds. And what he does is he gets us to thinking that we only have one direction, and that one direction is away. Get me away from that. Let me distance myself from that. But God gives a new direction. God gives a new purpose. And it's not just a way. He gives a new direction, a new purpose. So now we may look at this story and we may be a little bit concerned about the direction that God gives. We look at this and go, well, where does he send her? He sends her back. Back to the place where she's being mistreated. Back to the place where she's being abused. That's a little bit uncomfortable, isn't it? But what we can't do is use this verse to justify sending somebody back to a bad relationship. That's not the purpose here. That's not the point. That's not the lesson that we learn here. I think there's two things we can say about this. The first one is that by sending her back, God's saving her life. She's out in the middle of the desert. She's a woman. She's going to die out there in that desert. And that probably is her best outcome. What's likely to happen is she's going to encounter some men who are going to abuse her even further, and then she's going to die out there in that desert. So we have to keep that in mind. By sending her back, God is saving her life. And then the second thing is, why ask why? Hagar's not questioning it. Something in this encounter with God is causing Hagar to have confidence and trust in what God is telling her. Despite how difficult the word might be, how hard it is for her to want to do that, something's going on here where she's having the faith. She's having the confidence to put her trust in God. So what was it that in that experience that gave her that confidence and that trust to do God's word even though it seemed hard? Not only does God find us when we're lost, but God sees us when we feel invisible. In this story, Abraham and Sarah never call Hagar by name. You go back and look at it. They never once call her by name. Hagar is just a means to an end for them. She's just a way for them to get what she wants. In the ancient Near East, what we read here taking place is actually an acceptable practice. It was totally acceptable for a woman to have a surrogate handmaid to carry a child for her. And when that happened, the child that was born would legally become the child of the owner. And so, it seemed horrible to us what's taking place, but in that society that was totally acceptable. Now we could park here again and talk about letting culture dictate what's right and what's wrong. We're not going to do that either. But what we do need to see is that for this woman who felt mistreated and she felt abused and she was nameless, she's invisible, but she encountered a God that knew everything about her. He calls her by name. He speaks to her. He knows what she does for a living. He knows the people that she works for. He knows that she's pregnant. He tells her she's going to have a son. So Hagar goes from being this completely anonymous person to being intimately known by God. And look at how she responds. Look at verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Normally when we see God showing up in the Old Testament, he names himself and he discloses to man what he wants to be called. He determines what it is that he wants the humans to call him. But here, Hagar names God. She gives him a name. Nowhere else in the Bible do we see this taking place. But Hagar names God. Not a man. Not someone with power. Not some influential person. It's an Egyptian slave woman who gives God a name. And then what's interesting is, we're very early on in the Bible here, Genesis 16. Hagar becomes one of the first recorded theologians too. Because she now knows something about God. And she speaks what she knows. And in that way she becomes a theologian. She names him the God who sees her. Now, if I'm being perfectly honest, as a man, it is probably difficult for me to fully empathize with Hagar's situation, what she's going through. I'm sure that the ladies probably can identify with this more, because a lot of her plight is caught up in her gender, and a lot of her plight is caught up in motherhood. And I would say that if you've ever been an abused woman, you probably can relate even more to Hagar than what I could. And I think most women have this longing to be sought after and to be desired and to be pursued. And what we see is God chasing after Hagar here. And so women probably can relate to this better than I can as a man. You know, human logic is going to say, let's just make Hagar disappear from the story. She doesn't really, a non-issue here, right? But the truth is, everyone has a role in God's story. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you came from. And I think maybe single moms could probably relate to Hagar in a really strong way too. You know, I know single moms sometimes feel invisible. Does anybody really see all the work I'm doing? Does anybody really see what I'm going through to take care of my kid or my kids? Yes, God is a God that sees. And when you're laying there crying and nobody else knows it, nobody else sees it, but God does. Even though you're not crying out to Him. Psalms chapter 56, verse 8. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in a bottle. And then a rhetorical question. Are they not in your book? And that leads us to the last thing we're going to look at with Hagar this morning. So not only does God find us when we're lost, and not only God sees us when we feel invisible, but God hears us when we hurt. And sometimes we hurt because of our own choices, right? Sometimes I did something and I'm going to hurt because of it. But a lot of times we're more like Hagar. We hurt because of the choices that other people have made. Sometimes we live in the consequences of other people's actions. We live in the consequences of their sin. We live in the consequences of their mistakes. We live in the consequences of their selfishness. And I hope that we can understand what Hagar began to understand. And that is, when we hurt, God hears us. Look at verse 11 again. Behold, you are pregnant, and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. You see, Ishmael means God hears. You may have a footnote in your Bible. That's what the name means. God hears. You know, God has had some more to say about the boy, and some things are working through the boy on another level of the story. But Hagar, she's left with this new reality about God. Her reality is that God sees, God hears, and God has sought her out. So she goes back to Abram's household. It seems like everything's calmed down. This goes on for about a decade. Seems that Ishmael might actually be the son of promise. And then the unthinkable happens, at least from a human perspective. Sarah, in her old age, becomes pregnant with Isaac. Again, we see God keeping His promises, because He had promised that son to them. Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and now all those tensions start to resurface between Sarah and Hagar. Sarah realizes that Ishmael is not just a mistake from the past that she helped to cause, but she also now sees Ishmael as a threat to her own son and to the blessings for him. So she rears up and she tells Abraham, you have got to send Hagar and the boy away. Now this bothers Abraham. Now that's his flesh and blood. He's had the 10 years with the boy now, and so this bothers him. But God tells Abraham, I'm going to provide for him. So Abraham agrees. Now, look at Genesis 21. We'll skip ahead in the story, starting verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I'll make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And here we find her in chapter 21, and this situation is even worse than the first one. Now she's out in the desert, about to die with nothing. And to make it even worse, now she's got her boy with her. And she's going to have to watch her boy die. Now I think most of the mamas that I know would tell you that watching their children in pain is much worse than pain that they endure themselves. I know all you moms recognize that, don't you? And God's word to Hagar this time isn't that he hears her. What does he say? He said, I heard the voice of the boy. God hears the boy. And God kept his promise from chapter 16 that he's going to sustain her and he's going to make Ishmael into a great nation. Okay, now what do we do with all this? Let's think for just a minute about the different levels of the story and how they apply to us. So at a personal level, Hagar, we can identify with Hagar because we deserve what Hagar was getting. Spiritually, we were rebellious. We rejected God's rule, rejected his reign, we rejected his authority. In our sin, we were evicted. We ended up being sent away. We earned it. We deserve what you would find out in the desert. What's out in the desert? Nothing. A wasteland. Death. But God meets us there with his mercy, with his love, with his kindness, with his grace. And God provided that wellspring of eternal life through Jesus for all of us, so that we don't have to stay out there in the desert. Now the Bible tells us that Jesus faced rejection and he faced pain and suffering and anguish, the things that we deserve, the things that we should have, so that we could be accepted. And Jesus was rejected and he was despised as if he was outside of God's promises. He took that wasteland of the desert, that pain and that sorrow, and he brought us the wellspring of God. And then on another level of this story becomes the journey of the people who are in on the promises of God. And then there's the people who are out on the promises of God. So Hagar and Ishmael are outside of the promises of God in so many ways because they're Gentiles. They aren't the ones that God originally spoke to. They aren't Abraham and Sarah. They were part of a group that's outside of God's promises. And that us versus them mentality carries on all the way up until after the death of Christ. And then word starts to spread. Hey, wait a minute. This gift of Jesus is for everybody. It's not just for the Jews anymore. Bring in the Gentiles. And so the way that God provided for Hagar, even though she was outside of the promises, is the same way that God provides for us in Jesus. And then on an even bigger level, Hagar is a victim of abuse, and she's a victim of oppression. And that type of pain goes on to this day. I mean, we live in a system, even though we don't have this entirely male-dominated patriarchal society, there's still this oppression that is perpetuated through systems. You know, the thing is the world is a broken, evil, sinful place. And we all have to live in it. We all have to deal with it. And Jesus ushers in this new kingdom. Jesus' work on the cross said sin and death are not going to have the last word anymore. And this won't be because the world is a wasteland, but he's going to remake it for those of us that are in him. God, the God that showed up to Hagar, is the God that shows up today. But I'm left with one really big question about this. How did she forget? When you think about that encounter with God in chapter 16, and then here she is in chapter 21, how did she forget that? God's speaking to her. The God who saw her, the God who heard her. Here she is in chapter 1, she doesn't cry out to him. You know, I'm afraid that time and disappointment and pain can do that to all of us. We can forget to call out to God. But we can take comfort that God is still there. He still hears. He's still attentive. He wants us to cry out to him. Now, I guess just to close, maybe some of us are like the Hagar of chapter 16, where we have some pain in our life, and it's not entirely our fault. And we have some pain in our life that we're trying to run from. And I want you to remember that God hears you when you're hurting. Or maybe you're like the Hagar in chapter 21. You're hurting because of because somebody that you care about is hurting. She's got this little boy out here in the desert, and it's causing her pain. And sometimes we have that type of pain too. We hurt for other people. Maybe it's your child. Maybe it's somebody in your family. And we're all here this morning as a support to each other. We're here to help each other through the pain and through the hurt. It shouldn't be just this morning. It should be all the time. But if you're in that situation that Hagar was in, we'd love to pray with you. We'd love to pray for you. That's part of God's design, is that we lean on each other in difficult times, and that we pray for each other. And I don't want you to think for a minute that coming down here to ask for prayers has got any type of negative connotation at all. It's not a sign of weakness. God's will is for us to bear one another's burdens. We want to lift you up in prayer if we can. Whether it's a hurt because of what somebody else has done to you, whether it's a hurt because someone you love is hurting, whatever it is, we can pray for each other. So if you have a need for a prayer this morning, make it known, if you would, while we stand and while we sing.